Welcome to our afternoon session. This will be the last session of the conference. I'm really excited to present to you this talk on natural language processing in psychiatry. I'm Eric Lynn, a fellow at the Medical Informatics Fellow at VA Boston, and also a research fellow at McLean Hospital's Functional Neuroimaging and Bioinformatics Lab under Doctors Justin Baker and Assistant Director Anat Liebenthal, also the co-chair for this talk. We're really excited to present to you some works representing the current landscape of natural language processing in psychiatry, especially with regards to spoken language. There's a lot of exciting advances in the mainstream NLP. As an example, I provided this image in the bottom right of using a NLP AI drawing of what it imagines as a technology and psychiatry conference session if we were gathered in person. So while there's a lot going on in the mainstream computer science side of natural language processing, we're really excited to share some of the pioneers on the psychiatry side of our. So giving some context to all this, in 2012, we saw one of the big turning points in the current kind of AI fad. This model AlexNet came out and really changed what it meant for deep learning, AI, and one of the big breakthroughs was using graphics processing units and convolutional neural nets to really win this image recognition contest. And since then, the field of image recognition and computer vision has really grown quite quickly, and these technical advances really seeped into medicine, especially radiology, dermatology, and ophthalmology. I believe one of the strong reasons why these medical fields have had such traction in this kind of AI medicine trend is because one of the main diagnostic modalities for these fields is based on images, whether it's x-rays, skin lesions, or fundoscopic examinations and images. They were really able to leverage the great advances in AI, which a lot of them at the time were in the field of computer vision. With regard to natural language processing, we've seen a similar explosion of advances in technologies after the pivotal attention-based transformers architecture was introduced in 2018 via a model commonly known as BERT. You may have heard in the news about these wild stories about how people have trained NLP models from the texts of their deceased romantic partners, or how several engineers are, how these models have started writing software code, or how some engineers are concerned that these models are becoming increasingly sentient and salient. But behind all this kind of sensational reporting, there's clearly a trend in increasing performance of these models in grasping human language. So which brings me to think that since psychiatric assessment is primarily done via clinical interview and focuses a lot on what patients say about their symptoms, I want to make the bold prediction that we're going to see more than we already have psychiatry really be transformed by these breakthroughs in natural language processing. So just what can we expect from natural language processing in psychiatry? We can get objective, quantitative approximations of clinical phenomena, which have been traditionally hard to measure, such as stutters, tangential speech, or just the affect of such speech. Similarly, psychiatry struggled with reliability of diagnosing due to the subjective nature of evaluation and the heterogeneous kind of nature of just being various clinicians from different backgrounds, different kinds of training. Individual models can really help us give us more precise and reliable measurements across multiple circumstances. A lot of the work has already been done on discovering speech and language signals for helping with diagnosis, discovering disease subtypes, or even risk stratification. And lastly, this work can we're hoping to pick up on signals that may be hard to consistently detect with human assessment, whether that's changes in voice or word counts specifically that are just not hard to normally capture just in a normal clinical interview. So today we're going to go over many of these topics with our speakers. They'll talk about their past work, the current research, and future directions. Just for some housekeeping, we're going to have 4 15-minute talks with a bit of time for 1 to 2 moderated questions per talk. I'll warn our speakers at 15 minutes when their time's coming up, and we'll have 1 or 2 questions then. At the end of all the talks, we'll have a longer discussion. They'll answer many of the other questions. A lot of the talks have some overlap in technique or interests. In fact, a lot of these researchers have worked together in the psychosis and natural language processing field. So I'll probably save some of those questions for the end if there's an overlap. And so without further ado, let's get into our talks. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so I'm going to have introduced Dr. Anat Lebenthal for our first talk. Dr. Anat Lebenthal is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Associate Director of the Functional Neuroimaging and Bioinformatics Lab at McLean Hospital. She's a cognitive neuroscientist by training and studies verbal and nonverbal communication in relation to psychiatric disorders via behavioral and functional neuroimaging studies. Take it away.
Thank you. Share my screen. Okay, thank you, Eric, for that introduction, and in fact for organizing us into giving this symposium. It's really a pleasure to to be among these colleagues who are going to talk about the ways that we can analyze speech in relation to mental health. So I'm interested specifically in verbal and nonverbal communication, and the ways that that communication breaks down in relation to mental health. And with this work, as I assume everybody here, I'm really hoping to inform the development of diagnostic methods and therapeutic interventions that will be science-based and that can advance our understanding of psychotic disorders. Actually, I guess I was here. Yes. So the study that I would like to focus about is an intensive longitudinal case series in psychotic disorder. This study is led by Justin Baker and Scott Rausch from McLean Hospital. It is funded by an NIMH UO1 award. In this study, we are collecting multimodal data in the participants' natural environment. So we're collecting clinical interviews where we analyze where we are able to analyze the participants' speech, but also voice and facial expressivity. We used to collect these clinical interviews on site, in person, and now we do that mostly via Zoom. So really in the participants' own environment. We also collect smartphone-based data, and that includes passive measures such as accelerometry and GPS, and active measures such as EMAs and audio journals. And in some participants, we also collect wrist actigraphy. So our immediate goal is to detect features in the raw data that are qualitatively associated with latent psychiatric variables. For example, here specifically, I'll show how we look at language features and try to correlate quantitative language features with qualitative clinical measures of clarity of thought or thought disorder. The longer term goal of that line of research is to find biological, environmental, and social factors that can predict severe mental states such as mania and psychosis in individuals who are at risk for these disorders. So far, up to the spring of this year, we have collected close to 85 person-years of data from 74 participants, some of whom were diagnosed with bipolar 1, some with bipolar 2, some with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. The density of the data in the different streams is not the same. And as I will explain later on, that affects our ability to conduct integrative analysis across data streams. So that becomes an important factor. I would like to focus here, obviously, on the language data that we collect, and starting with the clinical interviews. The clinical interviews are designed to collect enough information to score the PANSS, the positive and negative symptom scale, as well as several other scales, by posing several questions and having a brief discussion with the participant. Those interviews tend to be about 45 minutes long on average. This particular participant was in the study for close to 2 years, and during these 2 years, he was found to be typically at least mildly or moderately conceptually disorganized. So what this means is that, again, qualitatively, his thinking was found to be circumstantial, focusing on negative or on secondary details, tangential, digressing to random or irrelevant ideas or illogical, and he had difficulty to focus his thoughts. If you read the excerpts from one of the interviews, his vocabulary is quite good. He uses difficult words adequately, such as complacency and counterproductive and opportunity gaps. But what is striking about his speech is the disfluent delivery of his thoughts. He uses a lot of verbal fillers, such as "you know," "I mean," kinds redirects of his ideas. And when we quantify the amount of disfluency and the number of words that he uses per sentence, so how verbose he is, these measures, these quantitative measures, tended to be positively related to how conceptually disorganized he was found to be clinically. This participant also, as many others, described having some struggles sleeping. So here in this study, we don't have physiological measures of sleep, and in this particular participant, we also didn't have wrist actigraphy, but we have a close or a rough approximation in the smartphone measures. So we can look at screen use and accelerometry in the smartphone and get a sense of the activity and sleep cycle. So this participant was typically up until the wee hours of the morning, and then went to sleep. This is the gray low activity region pictured here. So he would go to sleep early in the afternoon. And the pattern is actually quite variable day to day. And in some days, he barely gets any sleep at all. And here again, if we quantify the sleep based on the smartphone, we see a potential relationship with how conceptually disorganized this person was. So when we looked across participants, we found significant statistical relationships between quantitative measures of language and clinical measures of conceptual disorganization. And similarly, we found relationships between quantitative measures of phone use and clinical measures of conceptual disorganization. Specifically, what this means is when across the group, when participants were more conceptually disorganized, there were more restarts per sentence in their speech, more repeats, more verbal edits, more disfluencies in general, more words per second, words per sentence. So they were also more verbose. And similarly with the phone features, participants who were more conceptually disorganized tended to make more use of their phone during the average sleep period. Some limitations of these data is that they really don't take advantage yet of our full sample. So only 145 interviews were included in this analysis. And I'm happy to speak more about what the reasoning was here. But these are the interviews that were transcribed at the point of when the analysis was done. Overall, our entire sample includes 740 some interviews, and the phone data also taken, the valid phone data was related to about half of that sample. So this limits our ability to conduct analysis across data streams, which is extremely important. So this is now moving on to another aspect of the data that we collect. These are the audio surveys. The audio surveys, in our case, are collected daily via the smartphone app. They can be up to 4 minutes long, and the prompt is very general, just prompting the participant to tell us something about the last 24 hours of their last 24 hours. And then we also collect on a daily basis micro-surveys, which in our case, these are 32 questions about emotional, social, physical functioning, and psychosis symptoms. And in this particular participant, I only have one participant to show here. We are just in the midst of analyzing these data. So in this one participant who was in the study for close to 4 years, and during these 4 years, he actually submitted almost daily EMA surveys as well as audio surveys. So the items that he scored the highest, self-reported of being the most important to him, or the most that he scored the highest in among the positive EMA items, were that he was, these are the darker colors here. So he felt mostly determined, inspired, alert, pretty regularly over the period. Only the 175 first days are shown here. And then the negative items that he reported as being highest, that he felt the most were being anxious and lonely and upset. So how did we analyze those audio surveys? So on the one hand, we had one of our staff members who listened to each of the surveys and annotated some important event that the participant noted, such as father's death anniversary, financial troubles and panic attacks, family reunion, and so on. And we also conducted sentiment analysis using the Vader software, which returned a score between -1 and +1 for very negative versus very positive sentiment. And we looked at the correlation between the sentiment scores and the EMA scores and found a strong positive correlation between the sentiment scores and the positive EMA items, and a strong negative correlation between the sentiment scores and the negative EMA items. So this is another study that I'll just mention. This is a study that was conducted in inpatients, as opposed to the study that I mentioned before, which is almost entirely in outpatients. So this study is an analysis of clinical interviews in inpatients, where we again found significant relationships between the number of words in different semantic categories and clinical measures of psychosis and mania. Hopefully this gives you a taste of where we are with this. We are finding significant relationships between quantitative measures of spoken language and clinical measures of different symptoms of psychosis. Many of our team have been involved in this work, including Eric, particularly in the analysis of the audio surveys. We have much more work to be done.
We have one question from Sunny about have these results been published yet?
The second study that I showed, yes, you saw the publication. The first study about the disfluency is in is being revised and resubmitted and hopefully published soon in Schizophrenia Research in a special issue, I think edited by Guillermo and
Cheryl.
Cheryl, thank you.
That's fantastic. I think we have some convergent results there, so I'm looking forward to seeing your paper. Yeah.
Looking forward to hear about this, yes.
Camera asks, what's the time window to compare phone features and clinical feat scores, I think P2?
Sorry, can you say that again, or I could read, yeah. What is the time? Yes. So the clinical interviews are collected on a monthly basis. And the questions that are being asked about the last months prior to the interview. The same thing about the phone features, they are being summarized over the past months prior to the interview. So the phone features are being analyzed in a time-locked way, if you will, to the clinical interviews, because the clinical scores are also collected in the clinical interviews. Yes, we use, so in terms of the app that we use, we for this study, we have been using BWE for both the passive sleep measures and the EMAs, as well as the audio surveys. We are now shifting to using MindLamp.
Just a quick question, maybe. Do you find any relationship between sleep and disorganization of thought?
I think this is a fascinating question, and that is really the question that we were hoping to answer with this type of work, and this is where we would like to go. But that is a limitation of our current data, because we don't yet have the data, or at least this analysis, we were not able to conduct it across those modalities because the overlap wasn't great enough. We actually have the data. We need to transcribe all the interviews and potentially conduct this analysis, but this is where we would like to go with this. Yes.
Okay. It's an important question, because if maybe we're looking at healthy controls and they're not getting enough sleep, it
Sure.
really changes how we look at disorganization of thought.
I am just at a bipolar conference here, or a meeting, yes, in my hotel room, and there is great emphasis here on the importance of energy as the main, as the dysregulation of energy as the main characteristic of bipolar disorder. And there is really a strong push to better measure energy consumption. So there is a lot of interest in that.
Great questions. I'll have to move on to the next talk now, and we can save any further questions for the end. So next up, I want to introduce Dr. Sunny Tang. She's an assistant professor of psychiatry at the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. She's also a board certified psychiatrist, and her research expertise is in between technology and psychosis, particularly computational methods to generate biomarkers for schizophrenia and spectrum disorders. Her work on natural language processing to generate biomarkers for psychiatric disorders is supported by a K award from the NIMH, a Young Investigator Grant from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, as well as industry sponsors. Alongside Dr. Tang, Dr. Yan Song will be co-presenting this talk. They are a postdoc in Dr. Simi Tang's lab at the Feinstein Medical Institutes for medical research as well. And prior to that, they did their PhD in linguistics. Their current interests are in understanding schizophrenia using transformer-based representations of knowledge and language.
Thanks so much, Eric. Are you guys seeing the slides in full screen? Okay. All right, great. So hi everyone. I'm Sunny.
Hi, I'm Yan.
So Yan and I are going to go back and forth a little bit in this talk here. Here are our disclosures. I should highlight that some of the research was supported by Winterlight Labs, which is a startup company that focuses on speech and language biomarkers. And of course, here's our fantastic team. I think the highlight of my career is to work with such brilliant and fun people. So much credit to everyone listed here. I think one of the most captivating things about what we work with in psychiatry is also perhaps one of the greatest challenges. And I would characterize that as the core problems that we're dealing with, which are made up of thoughts and emotions, really intangible stuff that I think in a sense makes up the core part of who we are as humans, but at the same time are completely impossible to measure directly. So we're always forced to rely on indirect inferences to understand people's thoughts and emotions. So I would argue, and I'm perhaps preaching to the choir here, that speech is, I think, perhaps the most direct reflection, in fact, of our underlying thoughts and emotions. And in particular, I conceptualize the psychotic disease process and maybe psychiatric disease processes in general as under the surface, producing changes in thoughts and emotions, which can then be reflected in observable changes in speech and in terms of what Einat described, also changes in behavior and other phenomenon as well. In fact, in schizophrenia, disturbances in speech has been equated from the very beginning to thought disorder. So for example, Emil Kraepelin wrote in his description of dementia praecox, incoherence of the train of thought is usually distinctly noticeable in the conversation of the patients. The most different ideas follow one another with most bewildering want of connection, even when the patients are quite quiet. So now, today, with computerized natural language processing techniques, we have the opportunity to objectively quantify how language is being used. And central to these NLP methods is a concept called word embedding. So I'm going to try to explain that a little bit. Simplistically, we can assign a vector in these examples here to describe the meaning of each word. So for example, cat, kitten, dog, and houses can be described as whether they are living, feline, human, the gender, royalty, et cetera, And based on these mathematical vectorized representation of the word's meanings, we can derive inferences on their relationships. For example, the similarity between cat and kitten would be closer to each other than they are to dog. And then these animals would all be closer to one another than to, for example, houses. And in addition, the nature of the relationships can also be inferred used mathematically and quantitatively. So for example, the relationship between man and woman is recapitulated in the relationship between king and queen. Really fascinating. So Britta Elvebag really pioneered the application of this type of NLP methodology to study what she termed coherence in the speech of people with schizophrenia. And I actually prefer the term semantic similarity instead of coherence to describe this type of analysis, because I think it's a more literal description of what we're doing. And I wanted to separate the analytical concept from the clinical symptoms that we're trying to model, but know that it's been referred to as coherence in the literature. And this approach has been used very successfully. So first by Elvavag here in this example, if she looked at increasing window sizes. And in the example here, if you look at a window of 3 words, you would take the embeddings for the first 3 words, the quick brown, and compare that to the embeddings in the second set of 3 words, fox jumped over. And then you would move down 3 words and then repeat the same process and so on and so forth. And Elvavag and colleagues found that with increasing window sizes, particularly for people with high thought disorder, there was a decreased semantic similarity compared to healthy controls and people with low thought disorder symptoms. And the similar techniques on semantic similarities using word embeddings have been used by other groups to successfully classify people with schizophrenia versus healthy controls, and to identify, in really groundbreaking work done by Guillermo Cecchi and Cheryl Corcoran, they were able to identify people with clinical high risk who transitioned to psychotic disorder versus those who did not. So, however, there's a major limitation to some of these traditional word embedding methods in that they are somewhat concrete in the way that they represent the words that they're trying to capture. However, there are newer transformer-based language models which utilize deep learning to go a little bit beyond. Actually, I loved how Phil characterized this in one of our preparatory meetings. He says that the transformer models get at perhaps a little bit of the structure of what is being said rather than just the one-dimensional meaning. So the objective of the study that we're going to present today was to compare some different transformer models using validated analytical strategies, and then to tie the computational results to different clinical ratings of speech symptoms and language phenotypes.
So for this study, we looked at 3 different types of transformer language models, and we compared them with a non-transformer type model, GLOVE, as the benchmark model. The reason why we chose these models is because they have different architectures. So BERT, which has only the encoder part of the transformer, uses bidirectional attention algorithm, whereas T5 has both encoder and decoder. GPT-3, which has only the decoder, uses causal attention algorithm. Based on the existing literatures, we also took 3 pre-processing approaches. For level 1 pre-processing, we basically took the verbatim. For example, Alex broke the vase. And for level 2 pre-processing, we additionally removed speech disfluencies. So the example sentence would have been processed as Alex broke the vase. For level 3 pre-processing, we took the embeddings generated from level 2 pre-processing and then take that input before we calculated the similarities. So here the stop words get removed. The example sentence becomes Alex broke vase. The word "the" gets removed. So we had 2 word level and 1 utterance level analytical strategies based on a recent publication by Alberto Perola and colleagues, which sought to validate these approaches in a cross-linguistic dataset. So for words level, we calculated K2 through 10, meaning word-to-word similarity at K interword distances. For example, consider an utterance, Alex broke the vase. So here, if we were looking at K equals 2, we'd take the first word Alex, compared the embeddings to the word 2 spaces down, which is the word the, and then we keep going for the whole thing. And for move 510, we calculated the average similarity of each pair of words in a given window. For example, move 5, consider an utterance, Alex and Kim broke the vase accidentally. So here we took the 5-word window, Alex and Kim broke the, and then we calculated the similarity of every word pair. So Alex and, Alex Kim, Alex broke, Alex the. And next we move to the next 5-word window, which is and Kim broke the vase. At utterance level, we calculated first order and second order coherence, meaning the similarity of utterance pairs, either adjacent or with intervening. For example, first order coherence. We calculated the similarity between consecutive phrase vectors. S1, Alex broke the vase, and S2, it was an accident. So to sum up, we had a 4x3x13 design, 4 language models, 3 levels of preprocessing, and 13 analytical strategies for calculating semantic similarities. So here is a demographic table for the full sample. And all of the data were collected from 2-minute responses to open-ended prompts. So we had 111 participants in total, with 74 in the schizophrenia spectrum disorders group and 37 in the healthy control group. As you can see here, they are statistically significant in age and race. So we tested matched sample. And here we had 74 participants in total, with 37 in each group. And here are some findings for diagnostic group effects, the full sample. And the numbers here are Cohen's d, namely the statistically significant between group effect sizes. So on the y-axis, you can see the analytical strategies we used, and the x-axis are the language models and the levels of pre-processings, which are divided into 3 portions. So on the left, you can see level 1 pre-processing and level 2 in the middle, level 3 on the right. And each level has 4 language models: GLOVE, BERT, T5, and GPT-3. So a couple of things stand out. First, there are significant effects for all of the models, and more measures in predicting group effects using transformer language models than in the benchmark GLOVE model. Interestingly, our findings also showed that language models showed different directionalities. So GLOVE and T5 showed decreased similarity in schizophrenia, whereas BERT and GPT-3 showed the inverse, increased similarity in schizophrenia. We found similar effects using matched sample, though with reduced sample sizes, there were fewer significant effects. So to sum up, it looks like language models can be useful. With certain probing techniques, they can generate increased signal for detecting a speech phenotype for schizophrenia. However, we do find that the models perform differently. So to test how language models responded to specific disruptions, we took 5 healthy controls transcripts. We randomly selected content words and replaced them with other words of the same part of speech derived from participants' responses. So we scrambled by replacing 0, 10, 20, 50% of the content words. So here are some examples.
Sorry, going back. Okay.
Yeah. So as you can see, as we scrambled more, it certainly makes the transcripts more difficult for humans to understand, and we wanted to see how models would handle this. And here are some findings. For BERT, scrambling the transcripts increased similarity for K2 through 10 and move 5 and 10, but not for first and second order coherence. And for T5, there were no observable patterns. For GPT-3, scrambling the transcripts led to a decrease in variance for K2 through 10 and move 5 and 10, but not for first order and second order coherence, as you can see in the bottom right figure. So to sum up, we simulated incoherence by word level substitutions, and it produces divergent results in different models. For BERT in particular, simulation was consistent with group differences for schizophrenia.
So next, we tried to understand what the transformer language models were doing by now looking at specific kinds of speech and language disturbances, so specific symptoms. And here we use Nancy Andreassen's TLC scale, which separately identifies 18 different speech and language related parameters. So for example, separate ratings for poverty of speech versus tendentiality versus incoherence. So here are the results for GLOVE. To go over what's on the graph, on the y-axis, you see those 18 different clinically rated TLC items. And across the bottom on the x-axis are those 13 different analytical strategies that Jan's been describing. And for GLOVE, we found that for the Move 5, Move 10 analytical strategies had the strongest results, and they were successful at tracking various different kinds of symptoms, including perseveration, loss of goal, derailment, and distractibility. Whereas BERT, on the other hand, was only really correlated with stilted speech and a little bit with self-reference on those word level strategies. So that's really not what we were thought that we were studying with the BERT paradigm. T5, on the other hand, had a different pattern still. So for those utterance level K through to 10, as well as the Move 5 and Move 10 methods, it tracked mostly with the quantity of speech produced or the fluency. So positively related to pressure on one hand and negatively related to poverty of speech. And finally, with GPT-3, we get yet another pattern for the same analytical strategies. So the word level strategies here were consistently correlated with disorganized type symptoms like tangentiality, illogicality, clanging, and neologisms. So to sum up, we found that different transformer models, even using consistent analytical strategies, are really tapping into different kinds of speech disturbances. The strengths of the signals that we're finding suggests that there's potential information to be gained in tapping into these transformer-based language models and the deep learning that they incorporate. However, I think that we still really need to do a lot more work in teasing apart what exactly is captured, but when we use these models. For example, if we're interested in disorganization, I wonder if we should dig deeper into GPT-3 rather than BERT. And in terms of future directions, we're planning to add some additional simulations in order to further tease things apart, as well as perhaps looking at different statistical measures. So we saw that with GPT-3, perhaps it would be good to look at changes in the variance of features as opposed to changes in the mean. And so finally, I liked how Jan summed this up previously. She was saying, you know, the transformer models are really cool, but how amazing they are depends a lot on how you're interacting with them. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Really interesting. We have a question from Guillermo. Do you want to say that for the audience?
Yeah, so maybe, yeah. So the question is, I don't remember how you summarize the coherence, for example. In the past, we found that either looking at the minimum or the maximum, perhaps is more relevant. Among other things, presumably these are not normally distributed features. So, you know, computing the mean might not be enough. And you mentioned something about the standard deviation after I posed my question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Guillermo. That's a really great point. We did in a previous version of these analyses, we chose more median-based statistics. So we actually looked at the 5th percentile median, the 95th percentile, and the interquartile range. So we plan to apply those same measures to this current round of analyses, but we just haven't gotten there yet. So yeah, so perhaps actually some of those might be even more consistent than what we're finding with the mean. So yes, certainly more to be reported.
Okay, so I think, oh, go ahead.
Thanks.
Maybe a quickie, really fascinating talk. I enjoyed it a lot. But I am wondering, so you're measuring similarity, are you? I mean, in other words, you're choosing different sets of sentences, different sets of or blocks of text to compare, and extracting and I'm guessing sometimes that similarity in the case of GLAVA would be probably cosine. In the case of these transformer models, like, was it cosine? And were you extracting and embedding from, let's say, one of the layers? And which layer?
Jan, do you want to
Yeah, it's
address
cosine.
that?
Yeah,
Cosine.
it's cosine and layers. Yes. For T5 we used last hidden state, and BERT we used the 12th layers, the 12th layer, and
Okay,
GPT-3 we you know it. Yeah, we used the OpenAI API.
okay, and you could get a hold of, so I mean, those negative versus positive correlations may be related to whether you're, looking at the activation pattern or the hidden layer or the weights, basically. So maybe I'd have to think it through. Yeah,
Right.
but that's that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. Okay.
Great questions. Yeah, okay.
So, very smart to modify the data and, simulate incoherence and see the effect. Are there other types of, other type of alterations that you can think of in addition to word substitutions? Are there other types of alterations that you can think of that could be used to further simulate how the different transformer models perform?
Yes, that's a great question. Actually, if you guys can add to the brainstorm, I'd appreciate it. So far, we didn't have time to go through the results, but we actually also tried scrambling on the utterance level. So we preserved the whole utterance and then scrambled them, and it was it produced, I think, less of an effect, but similar trends to what we saw with the word level scrambling. Actually, I think maybe there's just too many. One thing that I thought would be interesting and fun to look at, but I think maybe it involves too many moving parts to make scientific inferences. But Yen and I were playing around with GPT-3 a while ago, and we got GPT-3 to I thought fairly accurately simulate psychotic speech. So if you gave it some brief examples of psychotic speech, it was able to generate new psychotic speech. So we thought about inputting that back into the transformer models and seeing what we got. But then, but since there's such complex deep learning involved, it becomes even harder, I think, to tease apart what's going on. But it is cool.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, just to keep us on schedule, I'm going to move us on to the next talk, which is going to be with Dr. Philip Wolf, who's a professor of psychiatry at Emory University. He leads concentration in cognitive and computational science and serves as a faculty member in the concentration in clinical science. His primary research areas are in language semantics, machine learning, and natural language processing, as well as digital phenotyping. And alongside Dr. Wolf, Dr. Negin Rezai will also co-present this talk. She's an instructor of neurology at Mass General Hospital, and as a physician investigator, she works in the frontal temporal dementia clinic and also does research. Her work focuses on the use of NLP processes to extract latent signs from the language of neuropsychiatric patients to improve the diagnostic accuracy and also further understanding of these disease processes.
All right, thank you so much. I'll be co-presenting this talk with Dr. Philip Wolf. As already discussed, in the past decade, there has been a surge in use of NLP in neuropsychiatric disorders. In an ideal scenario, we would love to get language samples from patients and feed it to an appropriate language model in order to do certain tasks, such as quantifying clinical features such as coherence, reference to voice, reference to pain, or do some classification tasks, and then give the output to a physician in order to assist with the classification and diagnosis. So one disease that is particularly suitable for this purpose is primary progressive aphasia. It is a neurodegenerative disorder that specifically affects the language network. It has got 3 subtypes, and this is a very simple algorithm to show the diagnostic approach. So the first question is whether the individual has a motor speech impairment or agrammatism. And then if the answer is yes, then probably it is the non-fluent variant of PPA with the left frontoinsular atrophy. If the answer is no, then there's a question of whether there is a phonological short-term memory deficit, basically just a repetition difficulty. If their answer is yes, then it is the logopenic variant with mainly left temporoparietal atrophy. And then if there is a single word comprehension deficit, it is the semantic variant with the anterior temporal lobe atrophy. So as you see, this language encompasses almost the entire language network, from the anterior temporal lobe to more posterior regions, to parietal regions, and then to frontal regions, and making a form of an inverted C. And as Dr. Wolf nicely says, it's a perfect, almost a perfect knockout model in which certain regions of the language network is knocked out, and we can probe its impact on the language output. So then with the algorithm, the diagnostic algorithm that I showed earlier, there are some difficulties and challenges with that. There are some patients who do not fit any of the subtypes, or they may meet the criteria of more than one subtype. There are 2 possibilities. Maybe the categories are wrong. So maybe there's only one category, maybe there are 4 categories. We do not know how arbitrary these categories are. And then another possibility is that maybe the categories are right, but the diagnostic criteria need to be refined. So we used AI in order to address these questions, and we got language samples from 78 patients with PPA from Mass General Hospital across the 3 subtypes, and we also included 20 healthy controls. As you see, these are the maps of atrophy for each of the variants and from our study, and they are pretty consistent with what has been described in the literature. And for the language task, we asked the participants to describe what's going on in this picture, which is known as the WOB picnic picture. So here are some of the examples from the participants: family picnic, father's reading, mother's pouring drinks, I used to sail. In this instance, the participant was talking about himself or herself, even though the task did not require them to do so, which turned out to be a diagnostic feature. And the question was whether a language model is able to find natural partitioning in the abnormalities seen in these language samples. To test this, we used T5, text-to-text transfer transformer, which is based on 11 billion parameters. And we used this language model in order to measure the similarities between sentences. For example, sentence 1 is a man is crying versus sentence 2, a man is screaming. T5 gave a similarity score of 3 out of 5, and it has been shown that there is about 93% agreement between T5 and human judges, what they think is a similarity across the sentences. This is the matrix that we had. And we've got under rows and columns the participant's ID, and this is de-identified, and we measure the similarity of sentences of all possible pairs of individuals, with the logic that individuals who share the same pathology would have higher score of similarity. And then we used a hierarchical clustering analysis approach on this matrix and got this result. So as you see, the first group that got separated is the agrammatic, and then another one, the next one was the logopenic, and the last one was the semantic, with the overall about 90% agreement between what we got from this model and from the clinical assessments. And maybe incidentally, there is this similarity between the structure of this solution and the diagnostic algorithm in clinic. And in order to just make sure that 3 is the actual number of cluster, we plotted the sum of square. And as you can see, from 1 to 3, there is a sharp decline. And after 3, the curve kind of plateaus, suggesting that 3 is probably the optimal number of clusters. So going back to the original question, maybe no, the categories are not wrong, and the subvariants do emerge as natural types, and it might be the diagnostic criteria that need to be refined.
Phil, you're still kind of muted.
Okay, great. So we see, I hope you see a PPA challenge here. And our question again was, well, given the problems we sometimes see in the case of diagnosis, could the categories be the problem? Well, it looks as if we've used this theoretical approach. Of course, T5 did not know about, or didn't know much about PPA, and yet we were able to recover a structure that looks as if it's reflecting that these are natural partitions in nature. So for the moment, we're going to say probably the problem isn't really the categories, but maybe it has something to do with the diagnostic criteria. One way we might be able to improve the diagnostic criteria is by identifying the kinds of linguistic features that tend to be lost in each type of subvariant. And to do this, we used a method. I'm not sure. Okay, here we go. We used a natural language processing package called Stanza. And with Stanza, we were able to tag the transcripts from our patients and tag them with respect to the parts of speech, various morphological features, as well as syntactic dependencies. So let's say in this case, we might, for man, it's a noun, it's a subject, and so on like this. One other set of features we wanted to be aware of and sensitive to were lexical features. In the stroke literature, it's been noted that there seems to be an interaction between fluent and non-fluent aphasics and particular types of verbs. In particular, those with non-fluent aphasia tend to reduce the number of uses of high frequency verbs. And those with fluent aphasia, there seems to be a similar but opposite reduction, this time in low frequency verbs. It's one thing to say, well, let's use high versus low frequency, but how do you define that? And Nagin and I noted that when we look at spoken word corpora, and by the way, spoken is the key in this case. If it was just written corpora, we did not get this effect. But if we look at spoken word corpora, we find there are a set of verbs, in particular 8 verbs that stand out across the COCA, the switchboard, and the Santa Barbara spoken word corpora. And the verbs that stand out here are be, do, get, have, know, say, and think. Now, that's only 8 verbs, but actually, if you look at the number of uses, the types of verbs people use in their transcripts, that accounts for 50% of their uses, those 8 verbs. So, in addition to the features extracted from Stanza, we also impose this feature, which would be high and low frequency verbs. So in terms of the procedure, the first step was to look at the different features that are extracted and simply count how often they're observed for each subject. For example, here we're looking at conjunctions, number, determiners, explicatives. All of these have a wonderful story to them, but we'll just move on. And the next step was to convert those counts into residuals that reflect whether they are counts that are above what you would expect from, let's say, a normal, healthy individual, or less than you would expect from a healthy individual. correcting for especially low frequencies using the formula right here, this adjusted residual. Lastly, once we have the residuals here, we can add dummy variables that code for the type of variant. For these participants, they were all agrammatic. For these, they were all logopenic. For these, semantic. We can look at the correlation between those dummy variables and the residuals. And we expect, given that we are looking at atrophy, that we should focus on the types of residuals that show declines. And so our expectation, or what we were looking for, would be correlations, basically negative correlations with those dummy variables. And here are the key results. There were 31 features, and one thing I failed to mention, we used the Sims method of multiple comparison correction. It resulted in 31 features that met that criterion, that protection factor, protection threshold. And just in terms of the big story, the non-fluent agrammatic participants showed reductions in the use of pronouns, high frequency verbs, clauses, adverbs. The logopenics showed reductions in the frequency, in the low frequency verbs. And the semantics, which involve the temporal lobe here, saw reductions in nouns, determiners, and adjectives, perhaps. Here I've expanded the features to, all 31. You can see them in more detail. And one of the things I want to highlight is how the features tend to correlate with one of those groups, but not with the other. There's a selectivity to those linguistic features, suggesting a sort of a specialization of the cortex for particular kinds of linguistic processes. Here's a radar map. It shows sort of the relative relationship between the features and the different subtypes of PPA. Much of the features are accounted for by the frontal lobe, it seems, but then there's this interesting difference between the semantics in yellow and the logopenics in green. With these features, we can now ask, well, we have now maybe better diagnostic features. How well are they able to predict whether or not you have PPA? So we entered them into a logistic regression formula. We used 8-fold cross-validation to guard against overfitting. And we have a very significant result, but critically, we have a accuracy level that's quite robust, and also strong sensitivity, specificity, and precision measures. Also importantly, if we, let's say, remove the feature that distinguishes high and low frequency verbs, we find that our performance declines quite dramatically. So that distinction between high and low frequency verbs was seemingly critical to this. And by the way, this is a distinction that has not been made in the past. And we look at past literature that's tried to do exactly this, their performance is roughly in this neighborhood. So it seems as if it was this difference between the verb types that made the difference. Let me just sort of end with some general points. We were able to extract linguistic features that predicted the classes well. The high and low frequency distinction is critical. We also, in the process, are, I think, learning something about the language network. Now, you don't have to buy all of this, but if you take a minimalist perspective to the representation of language, initially, the idea is that you would combine nouns with things that, or merge them with things like determiners or maybe adjectives. Those in turn can be combined or merged with verbs, and those finally can be merged with tense markers to form sentences. So in an interesting way, it suggests a story about how processing may unfold, starting with the temporal lobe, round the C, into the parietal where you add the verb, and then you finish off with a tense to finish off with basically a clause or a sentence. So our challenges, again, were the categories wrong? We don't think so. Can the diagnostic criteria be improved, refined? We think so. And when we do, we can account for the differences between these subvariants. We also have some evidence now that these categories are for real, that they're natural partitions. And we have some hints about what may be going on at the cortical level. Thank you very much.
Fantastic presentation. Sunny, you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I was wondering if you thought that perhaps one of the reasons that high frequency verbs and low frequency verbs were teased apart is that often the high frequency verbs are not really the central predicate for the sentence, for example, and it's almost used like a filler. For example, it's cool, right? Or I think I saw him cross the street. I'm really saying I saw him cross the street, but I throw I think in there because I'm, because that's how I speak.
There is a story I think you could tell that very often those verbs act, they so-called as matrix verbs, and then they're going to be taking maybe a clausal complement. And if, for example, the frontal lobe is needed to handle or embedding, I mean, they might be related to each other, but you're also saying like the main import of the verb is sort of, that might be the critical idea, that those with, let's say, damage in the frontal lobe may have or struggle to capture the general idea. I guess it's hard to know how to rule that out yet, but that's an interesting idea.
Great. Guillermo's question, maybe we'll have this be the last question for this part, otherwise we're going to run out of time for Guillermo to talk at all.
Okay.
Well, I guess we just move on to the next talk then, and let me introduce Guillermo Cecchi. Guillermo Cecchi is the Director of Computational Psychiatry at IBM Research and also the Associate Director for Analytics in the NIH Advancing Medicine Partnership Schizophrenia Program, also known as AMP Schizophrenia. I'll just also add in that he's done a lot of work in this field for many years, and some of that work was also what inspired me to get into this line of research. So please take it away.
Yeah, so I'll try to go as quick as possible in the interest of time. What I wanted to share today is some ideas that we've been developing, trying to leverage what we know, what people know, what psychiatrists know in the field, in ways that are beyond what we've been doing in the recent past. Oh, man. Okay, so the basic idea is that we can think of sort of categories of ways in which we can leverage existing knowledge. Perhaps the simplest way is for psychiatrists to provide a label, patients class A, class B, what we call the differential diagnosis, and we have examples in the past where all we have is the class label. This is a patient, this is a control, and then we try to find information in the best way we can, right? So, for instance, finding particular features of the voice that we derive just from knowing whether the person is in one category or the other. Another approach, and we talked about this, and was mentioned in the previous talks, is we use symptoms. So we have symptoms from the literature, right? So for instance, thought disorganization, or flight of ideas, and we try to capture that analytically. So we take the symptom, and we use language embedding as a way of creating an algorithm that would reflect that symptom, and then we use that to see if we can find a signal in language. What I hope to discuss in the remaining time is a generalization of this. So that's the challenge for us was thinking, how can we get information from individual expertise inside, but also something more systematic, like, for instance, assessment inventories. And that's what we'll cover now. So we have quite a bit of work around psychosis. So we're going to show a couple of results and specifically apply to psychosis. And for that, we resort, and there's the first approach in incorporating expert knowledge is we resort to some theoretical insights that have been proposed to characterize psychosis and related to the overall idea of psychosis as a distortion of anxiety, a distortion of the self. And there are sort of two parallel theories. One is that that distortion is at the level of the narrative self. This is the self that has a discourse around what the person is, how the person understands his or herself, as opposed to a distortion of the minimal self, the pre-reflective, the self that is used to react when someone calls your name in the street. So regarding the narrative self, what is that we did? So essentially, and thanks Sunny for describing at the level of what was necessary for this meeting, what we call by vector embeddings. So what we did in this case, we discussed with the experts, in particular the experts in this way of thinking about psychosis, and we asked them, can you give us a number of sentences in particular that might be describing the experience of the distortion of the self in terms of in particular the narrative self and specifically the notion of agency and a distortion of the understanding of the self-understanding of agency that a patient with schizophrenia would have. And that's what we did. So we had a good number of interviews, open-ended interviews where the patients and controls talk about the story of their life. Right? So emphasizing the narrative aspect of this theoretical perspective on psychosis. So we just took the sentences that were provided by the experts and embedded them using off-the-shelf language embedding Lambert. And then what we did was for each interview, we projected using semantic similarity, each interview onto these embeddings, right, onto the subspace defined by what the expert insights are. And what we found there is that, first of all, we got a very good separation between classification as a sort of a sanity check between controls and patients, but also if you do a factorization of this subspace defined in that way, we get that there are two prominent factors that separate the groups. One is related to overall emotional tone and burden, but the other one, that is the strongest one, is a factor that is very prominent in the schizophrenia population, and it's precisely related to this idea of distortion of experience of self and the distortion of, in particular, of the experience of agency and self-agency. And on top of that, we found that it is possible to infer symptoms from those from this subspace projection of open-ended interviews. And if you factorize, as in the previous slide, what you get is that the self-experience and agency factor is very highly correlated with the symptoms. So I mean, that's one way that we found that it might be possible to further integrate insights and knowledge beyond just symptoms. So along similar lines, we did something with the, like I said, the parallel theoretical interpretation of psychosis as distortions of anxiety, related to the idea that what's really distorted is the minimal self, and not the narrative self. And for that, we were even lazier than in the previous example. So all we did was to take the inventory, the iPace inventory questionnaire that was developed precisely to evaluate this distortion that it's especially reflected in the idea of hyperreflexivity. People think about what they're thinking too much, but not in an introspective way, right? So it's mostly like surprised by what they're thinking and diminished self-affection. So this is the inventory is intended to be administered to the patient, and the patient feel a scale. What we did was the same thing as before. We have open-ended interviews. We encode using the embeddings, the items of the questionnaire, and then we project the open-ended interviews onto the subspace defined by the questionnaire. And then we can do lots of things with that, but in particular, we found that as again a society check, we can separate very well not only schizophrenic patients for control, but also the clinical high-risk population at risk of developing psychosis, using this high-dimensional embedding onto the iPace questionnaire. And this is just a representation of two-dimensional representation of this higher dimensional space. That now we can do further interpretation on this because we have a space that is manageable and it's interpretable in ways that maybe will become clear when I present the last part of what I wanted to discuss. Now, this has got us thinking about, like I said, further interpretation. For that, I think it's important to mention something that we did in a very different psychiatric condition, psychiatric neurological condition, which is chronic pain. And I hope it will become clear why I'm doing this. So this is something that we were working for some time. We found that it's possible to induce a placebo response in patients that have chronic pain just by giving them a phone app in which they record the daily pain. So what's interesting about that is that we took exit interviews and we found that it was possible to separate responders and non-responders, and it's blinded in the sense that the patients themselves don't have access to the record, so they don't know whether they're placebo responders or not. Then we took that and we ran a prospective analysis, a prospective study. We found that now we could use also baseline interviews and predict response to placebo with a significant accuracy. But why I mentioned this is because the way we've determined the anchor topics and for backward compatibility reasons, we didn't use the more contextual embeddings like BERT. We used GLOVE and LSA. The way the anchor topics to analyze semantically the interviews was done by my colleague Sarah, by just reading a huge amount of literature and selecting groups of concepts that then we were down selected in order to come up with a number of relevant target topics to analyze the interviews. And then after that, also the interpretation was very pedestrian, because what we did was to look for sentences that had a high similarity to the topics that were relevant for discriminating placebo responders and non-responders. So this is all still very labor intensive and not systematic. So what we have done more recently is, okay, I don't know how we're doing with time, more systematically is using now BERT embeddings or similar, like were described before. We have interviews with patients that have chronic pain in the form of fibromyalgia or neuropathic pain. So we create a classifier, but now we use what's called interpretable AI. So it's a model that allows you to identify specific anchors that typically are words, or collection of words that provide for separation between the two groups, right? So some examples you have at the bottom, where you can, in each sentence, you can identify a word or a couple of words that are essential to provide for the classification. And then if you do this at the sentence level, what you have is something that we call facets, which are words, individual words that are highly determinant of the classification, right? So you can categorize that as nouns and verbs or adjectives. But so far, that's not the end of the story, because then what we do is use that to generate summaries that are informed by the expert in chronic pain in particular. So what we do is we use the BERT or similar summarization techniques that have been trained to essentially to create summaries of the news articles, and as such, they don't contain any psychiatric expertise. So what we do is have the expert select among the facets that were identified by the classifier, down select the ones that the expert thinks are more relevant, and then filter the whole interview and feed that again into the automatic summarizer. So we end up with a very constrained summary that contains some, maybe not all of the facets that were selected by the experts, but we can measure that. We can measure the overlap between what the expert selects and the final summary in order to iteratively find the optimal summarization according to what the expert thinks is important, and create a much more interpretable understanding of what the patient said that is it's consistent with a good classification, a good differential diagnosis, but also contains much more structure beyond single words, because you have literally entire segments of what the patient is saying, but summarized in a compressed manner. So with that,
yeah, you're about 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay,
Just a little over.
Yeah, I'll just stop here, and if there are questions, I can answer.
I'll just say for the audience, and for anyone still here, it's at 3 o'clock, so I apologize. I've not managed the time very well for some very interesting talks, but talking with the conference organizers, we're free to have this room as long as you want. So if anyone has to drop off, please do. Don't want to hinder anyone from that, but if anyone wants to stay and just chat, I'm free.
Great.
So please, questions for Guillermo.
Guillermo, I'm really interested among a lot of things here, including, it's not the most interesting, it's one thing, it's the interpretable AI, and how you are using this. And what does it tell you, or what does it give you? I mean, at a broad level, it's an approach that is able to kind of provide some insight into what, let's say, the system has done, or how it solved the problem.
Right. So yeah, this is one way to think about this is that this was mostly developed for deep learning, right? So you have a classification task, you feed this into deep learning, you get fantastic classification, you have no idea why. So people develop approximations to simpler models like SVM, or actually decision trees.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can think of this as some way of making a decision tree out of your classifier, right? So here the example is, I have these two sentences, and one comes from a fibromyalgia interview, and the other one comes from a neuropathic pain interview. And I want to know, what is it that is providing for the classification. And this method will pick up, in one case, massage and night and excruciating, and the other one is everything, tried everything, well, feel well, right? So, and those words are the ones that are more relevant, because this includes also a stability analysis. So if you change a little bit words around, preserving, for instance, the part of speech, those are the words that are more sensitive. If you alter that, then
Right.
the classification fails.
That's interesting.
Right, and it's called the anchor model. But there are other models, but for language, anchor model seems to be the most interesting one, right? And so in that way, you have some idea of what is this very obscure deep learning model doing that will provide the good classification. Right? So that's the basic idea of interpretability.
And interestingly,
here.
It seems relevant to the sense of self. I mean, in some would say.
Well, yes, actually, in the process of learning more about fibromyalgia, there is so much. It's because fibromyalgia, it overlaps with other conditions.
Okay.
Yes, so it's the most interesting aspect of chronic pain, I would say. More generically, what we found in the other results is that there is an issue with emotional regulation in terms of placebo responders or not.
Mm-hmm.
And now specifically for fibromyalgia, there is less placebo response. Yeah, and there is a heavy psychiatric component to fibromyalgia.
Interesting.
Sunny, you want to ask your question? And we have a number of questions from the audience as well.
I was actually just going to type that maybe we should prioritize the audience questions.
great. Yeah. I want to start with one that was meant for, I think, for Phil's talk about the high versus low frequency verb distinctions. The question was, do we have a reason to believe high and low frequency verb distinction is related to linguistic features of those verbs? For example, irregular verbs versus regular verbs, or something that may be particular to English, might not generalize to other languages. How well does this generalize overall to other languages?
I'll start, and maybe Negin has. I know Negin probably has some. Negin, do you want to weigh in on that? Or? No.
Yeah, about other languages, we don't really know. It's actually very recent finding. So what has been interesting is that it is not just words, even with syntax, there are certain rules that are used more often. So this discontinuity that Phil showed doesn't just apply to verbs, but also some syntactic rules. And I was talking with Phil before about Zipf's actually third law seems to be the fact that certain few words tend to be repeated and used a lot more often than the rest of the words. So whether lexically they're processed differently in the brain, we don't know yet. But to us, it was fascinating that, as Phil emphasized, in spoken language, it seems like that discontinuity is doing a lot. About other languages, I don't know yet, but it would be interesting to see if it is a cross-linguistic feature.
Maybe to extend that a little bit, one connection I like, but it's probably over-interpreting. But in linguistics, there has been a long a belief that the way syntactic trees are organized is binary. And when we look at certain verbs like give, that's not how it works. I mean, there's more than two, it's a trinary kind of relationship. And the solution has been to propose that it's actually it's actually binary for a verb like give. And that what you do is you have a so-called little v. And the little v is made up of these really very high frequency verbs. So it's been a problem that's bewitched linguistics for like multiple decades, like how do we get binary branching? And the solution that has been emerged is to posit the existence of these verbs, these lighter verbs that sort of help you to maintain that. Interestingly, it doesn't line up with the so-called light verbs quite perfectly. These are a well-known class of verbs, but the ones we're finding are a little different set than that others have noted with respect to lightness. And we were struck by the fact that we looked at 3 separate corpora and found the same verbs over and over and over. That was a surprise. So is it, and lastly, my own work I've looked at across languages with respect to the most common syntactic frames. They're the same in Mandarin and in English, and they're associated with the same verbs. And it happens to often coincide with these really high frequency verbs. So I think there's a hint that this may be more than just an English thing. It may be something that cuts across languages.
This kind of reminds me of another one of the questions that was brought up for the overall panel. And I'll ask here, how do we think about change over time in society and language and these generating models? Can we get generalizable models derived from data today that can be applied in several years? And if so, how do we update models? Particularly interesting examples in young people where language change is much more rapid, and that demographic is also where psychosis, for example, often begins.
I can do something about that. Yeah, it changes, but there are ways of capturing that. So, we have done some work on Twitter, and so you can use Twitter, for instance, to anchor your models and track rapidly changing meaning in words, right? So, and eventually you can use that to identify, lingo, identify, subgroup, cultural understanding of what the word is, using, social media, things that like Twitter. So yeah, it's addressable, and of course the meaning changes, that we know, but I think we can track that.
How do you do that, Guillermo? Is that a fine-tuning process? Oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, you don't need fine-tuning because it's self-supervised, right? So so the way you train BERT is self-supervised, so you're not fine-tuning. Then you might need to decide, what is the time scale of integration. So do you think that means lasts 1 week or 10 days, or some sort of moving window? But that's I guess is the only parameter that you might need, and it might be also actually self-supervised too, right? So if you cannot predict very well next week from what you learned this week, you might need to adjust your model.
I wanted to add to that too, and I think it's also somewhat of an answer to the other question that was posed there about AI bias. That one way of study is to compare spoken language of an individual to a database, and there it becomes important to adjust for dynamic changes, because the standards or the normal is going to be what is represented in the database. But another way that we study is within an individual longitudinally. So when we look at an individual over time relative to themselves, then that kind of mitigates those issues about dynamic changes in the language, and also potential biases. Just wanted to mention that.
Quickly, what Yan and Sunny are doing, I think, is critical too. They show that you're getting the same result across different models. I mean, if it's a completely different story with a different model, then it's not interesting.
Completely agree. Yeah, thank you so much for doing that work, Sunny and Yan. That's so important for our field.
I just wanted to add a point. I've seen some projects online do a lot of this kind of thinking about like doing online learning for retraining these big models like BERT. We have to remember that BERT came out in 2018, 2019, so people are still just getting around to the idea that they've been around for so long, and so it's such a exciting, rapidly changing field. I think some of the things that have come up more recently is that people are trying to incorporate a lot of text from other languages, and we're seeing that a lot, especially in the speech recognition space, and just translation in general. That's been a good source of capturing and kind of dealing with diversity, but now you just get really diverse bias as well. So I think it's still a bit of an open question, but just want to throw that out there. If no one else has any other points, can move on to the kind of similar question on bias in psychiatry. So the question is, for the people who were at yesterday's session on AI bias in psychiatry, how do the lessons from there apply here? At what point should the research process should we be worrying about the generalizability or the potential for bias? NLP seems particularly vulnerable to this, and yeah, just interested in everyone's opinion.
I think the explainable AI that Guillermo was describing gets at that a little bit, right?
Yes, that's exactly my answer typically. So yeah, there is a problem of if you're part of a group or whatever that group is, however that group is defined, that does not produce a digital footprint, then there is not a lot we can do, right? But regarding specifically bias, when there is enough production, yes, the interpretation is essential. So I use the example. So years ago, I was analyzing interviews with patients in Colombia and in the original Spanish, and still there was something that didn't make sense because they were saying, all of them, that in the morning they would drink red wine, and it's just that they call coffee tinto, which is red wine in Spanish. So, it took me an effort to say, oh, tinto means in this particular lingo in Colombia, just black coffee. But right, if you don't care about anything and you just run the classifier might find that whatever, right, that these people are drunkards. So yeah, the interpretation is the additional work that we'll need to do to make sure that whatever black box process is meaningful. Right?
Yeah, and I think that we were trying to get at that a little bit also with our simulations, so that we know we're stepwise, systematically affecting individual elements in the language to make sure that we're measuring what we want to measure, and also looking at those individual symptom correlations as well. But super important question. I sometimes want to relate, like, basic, Eric, thanks for pointing out BERT's been around since 2019, and it's now one of the older transformer language models. So it's amazing how quickly this field is moving. But at the other hand, like, it just hasn't been around long enough, I think, for us to answer some of these very fundamental questions that we're still trying to address. It's almost like doing MRI imaging in like 1990 or something like that. So there's still a whole world out there to explore.
That analogy often occurs to me, that the earlier days of imaging were very problematic, and then rules kind of kicked in, best practices.
Yeah, so we're very much still trying to figure those out, I think.
By the way, I think in some sense there's bias on the part of the models, but of course there's huge amounts of bias on the part of humans. And I think one of the reasons we're attracted to the models is that they may be able to offer a perspective that is, well, never there's always going to be bias, but I mean, maybe we can contain it and study it.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing that these models, I mean, after all, we're just replicating what we do in our head, right? We are not doing anything different, right? So these language models are just reflecting what's in the data. But the advantage is that they allow us to do this at scale, right? So we were talking about analyzing 300, 400 interviews that last half an hour. How do you do that? You feel you don't have 300 PhD students, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think this helps us to expose issues that are not they're sort of hidden in the way we express ourselves, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's one thing that's emerging as the models get better, which is they can take different perspectives. You can ask them to take certain perspectives.
Exactly.
And so I think that can be an opportunity, actually. We can explicitly ask it to take the perspective of a particular group.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And this is something I didn't have time to mention. I had it in the slide, but we are experimenting with the idea of prompting, right? So with GPT-3, you can prompt.
Yes.
And precisely what you were saying, Phil, it will give you different answers according to how we interrogate it. Right?
Not to mention the different tasks, the different actual prompts that we're giving the patients to get the language, which then we use
Yes.
the prompt,
That's right.
et cetera, et cetera, et
Exactly.
cetera.
Yes. One thing about the self, or is there another question out there?
We ran through all, I think, the questions that have been submitted. I've checked other chats as well, but if you want to ask more questions, feel free.
Well, I don't know, Guillermo, if you know that I've been talking, GPT-3 seems to have a sense of itself, in the sense that, if you say, what do you think, it seems to know what you refers to. But some other large models like OPT and Bloom, which isn't fully trained, but it's on its way, really are confused by that question. They don't have a sense of like I or me, or they can't answer the questions like that. And I'm not sure what was under the hood when GPT was trained, but there's something going on between these models. They're not the same.
Right. No, they're not the same. Right. I think GPT-3 it's been trained with also dialogue, right? So it just take enough number of theater plays, then you have a dialogue there, and it's just reflecting that.
Right.
Which I think is very important, right? So because I'm not the one saying that; it's just replicating what other people say. Language is dialogue primarily, right?
Yeah.
Monologue is secondary, right? So, and this is how we learn. We learn from our mothers, interacting and then talking. And
thank you, because that's really the more interesting part of this. Like, what was what was in the training that sort of led to a greater sense of a more coherent sense of self, and maybe I'm assuming trained a lot on chat, and just got used to that kind of didactic kind of exchange rather than just facts. So that's something now that we can test. And in the case of schizophrenia, it raises, if we see some sort of move away from others, there could be this consequence for the self, because you're not in those relationships.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. We've actually looked at relationships between social cognition, social processing, and clinical and computational language characteristics. And we found that emotion processing as well as theory of mind were really closely related, because you could kind of go either way. So you can either think that their cognition, so they'll be related to negative symptoms type language, but actually in fact they were much more strongly related to disorganization. So almost like you really needed to have a working sense of a working representation, adaptive, also working representation of your conversation partner in order to produce coherent language. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So I that's so fascinating what you were saying about GPT-3. I wonder if training it on more dialogue could have produced an artificial social process, to introduce some element of that, which accounts for some of the differences that you're noting here.
Right.
Yeah, well, this goes back
Guillermo,
to the Turing test, right? So, he saw it 70 years ago. That's the crux of it, right? So can you talk to a machine? And that, that's the most interesting aspect of what we can do, at least with computational models, right?
I'm feeling we may need new tests, don't you?
Yeah.
It's because it's on the surface, they're very compelling, very convincing.
Yeah.
Guillermo, just a minor detail perhaps, but I was really interested by the TSNE results that you achieved, which had a really nice separation for healthy controls, the clinical high risk, and the psychosis group.
But that was based on the full, so we have the whatever, I think it's 50 items in the iPace. So we use that 50-dimensional representation of the interview. The Disney is just for representation, and it already shows nice separation, right? But the result,
Right. So
the
yeah, so
separation
I think
result
that's
was
what I
based on the full set of 50 projections.
And could you just maybe just refresh my memory again? What were those 50 projections? Like what kinds of features were they?
It's the iPace questionnaire, the items that are intended to expose this distortion of the pre-reflective self. Right. So the idea that there is too much of a preoccupation when you're thinking without being insightful, and the lack of self-effect, right? So, and this is what you give the patient. You give this to the patient and say, do you identify with this sentence, from 1 to 5 or 1 to 4? So instead of doing that, we just take the sentence and scan the interview. And the interview is an open-ended interview, so they're not responding to the questionnaire. They're just talking about themselves.
I see. Okay.
And
maybe I 50% see. I'll have to read the paper.
no, but again, it's simple, right? So we have these 50 birth embeddings of the items in the questionnaire, and then we go to the interview and say, you do just a dot product.
Right. Okay.
Right, and you end up with an average dot product for this item, another for this one, another for this one. So now your interview is 50-dimensional. But you reduce the whole 700 dimensions of birth to 50, and the 50 that you care about.
That's fascinating. I think you spoke about that at the SOBP conference as well.
I think so.
I
Yeah,
remember now. Yeah.
So I think we're coming up on the end of our time. Been warned that we have a hard stop at 3:30. Thanks so much for everyone for sticking with us, for the people who've been here. Again, thanks so much for the great talks. Just want to let everyone know that, again, all the sessions are recorded and they'll be available at the TIPS conference for the next month. This one will be available starting tomorrow. So again, thanks again for all of our speakers and for the questions.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for organizing, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.